how do you create a more grown-up and mature research and design organization? And I had come from these environments where people were teaching me what that meant. And I was really lucky to work with groups that were coming from environments that had worked with the best and were doing it at such a high level. And then this opportunity was like, okay, what have you learned and how do you put it into practice? And how do you take a company that wants to grow into that and take them through the steps to do it? So a lot of my role was really focused on how to build the discipline and the practice, but of course, how to execute and keep pace with a growing and changing company.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ignite podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have Lauren van Dehsen on the program. She spent 15 years at the intersection of hardware, software, and human behavior, designing products that people interact with every single day without thinking about it. She shaped the UX of the Nike FuelBand, very cool, when wearables were still a bet. Helped define how smart home devices talk to each other at Nest, very cool. And then informed the Matter protocol, now adopted by Google, Apple, and Amazon. Built Google Health's consumer UX org from scratch. And then spent 6 years scaling SoFi to a 100-person design and research operation. And the list goes on. Thank you so much for coming on, Lauren.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd love to, start with your origin story. What's your background?
I come from an industrial design background academically. I grew up in New York. Maybe that's also helpful to hear. And I went pretty quickly into technology and software development following graduation. So it was a great entry point into the world to kind of know that I wanted to pursue design much earlier than I find some of my colleagues knew that, and getting kind of a head start into the space.
Yeah. So what was the aha moment where you're like, I'm doing this. I'm doing the design thing?
Well, I've been credited as a very deep and sometimes overly deep thinker is maybe the best way to say it. And going into my college search, I was coming from a background academically that was very strong in math and science. Both of my parents worked at IBM and were in various forms of engineering and project management. But I had this kind of lucky extra context that my aunt and uncle had gone to Parsons and were both graphic and industrial designers and had been pursuing that career. And I grew up around that and got to see what they were doing. So I'm kind of a product of my environment and circumstances. But when I was looking through colleges and trying to really be thoughtful about what I was going to pursue, I found that as much as I loved the academics of math and science and learning it and studying it, I couldn't see myself being as excited about the careers I understood that would lead to, which wasn't necessarily all of the opportunities, but the ones that I had on my radar. And when I thought about the times where I was doing creative pursuits, whether that was alongside my academics or during the summer, I found that I had a different level of passion and interest. And so I'm very fortunate that it kind of all came back together and I actually used both sides of that. But I didn't know that when I was pursuing it and took the leap of what felt like a very risky leap to go down the design path.
Yeah. And I didn't really even get exposed to design until I became a product manager, right? And I
Yes.
came into product management from marketing. And so I was and maybe in marketing a little bit with landing pages and things like that and email layouts, but really it was like product management. I was like, oh, there's this whole world of how things are made. I think one of the first design books I ever read was Design of Everyday Things.
Yes.
Which is such a great book. Right?
Classic.
How are doors, doors designed, you could have a knob and you can have a plate and you can have a bar and what are the different reasons for those different affordances, right? To open and close doors. And you just learn this kind of stuff.
I think it's a real eye-opener, at least for me. I think I had this moment, and I can't quite place maybe what age it was at, but I had this moment where I went, wait a minute, everything around us, somebody made a decision about, whether it was an intentional decision, whether it was a consequential decision, because that's just what, they knew how to do. But everything that's not nature, somebody made a decision, and that is in and of itself design, right? And I think when you have that realization that it's just this hours and hours of work of all these people that came before you, it really gives you a different mindset of oh, well, what do I want to make? And how do I want to contribute to that? And what can I put out there? And then also, as a designer, what don't I want to put out there? Which I think starts to get to maybe deeper levels of ethics and contemplation.
Yeah. What do you think a product that you worked on, we kind of rattled off your amazing resume at the beginning. What's a product that you've worked on that you're just really proud of, that you look back and you're like, that was my best work?
I have a soft spot for anything that I put hours into, right? Because like anyone that works in the tech space, you really invest a lot in making these products. I think the chapter that always stood out the most to me was the Nest product suite, because they felt so substantial and monumental, and there's a level of excellence that the team and the company really committed to, particularly in the early
This
years
is
in the
Google,
era.
right? Before
Yeah.
Google acquired them, yeah.
Well, I joined right in the midst of the acquisition. There was a pretty big hiring spree, right? Because with the backing of Google, there was means to do it. But I like to say, I think when I joined, I used to think, how do I make people think that I was here before acquisition? I want to know all the details and make sure that I know this as best as I can. And, I think that was out of just a love and adoration for what the initial early team had done, and wanting to continue that forward as we expanded into what, was the kind of the height of the product suite that Nest put out across HVAC, smoke detectors, cameras, security, doorbells, etc. And so
Talk about
when
the
you
design of everyday things. I mean, you know, I mean, that's literally
very
it, right?
everyday,
Thermostats, smoke detectors.
the things that I think before that era you wouldn't even have really spent much time or energy thinking about, and now they're these somewhat high tech devices. And I think there was just such a beauty and excellence and attention to detail that the Nest team was able to deliver. And it was something that was just a standard that was held across every function, everyone on the company, no matter what they were contributing to the success of it. And so when I think of those products, I just think of them so fondly, because it just felt like the team was firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, and everybody knows and loves Nest products. If it's a great interview question. Actually, you can ask a product manager or a designer. Tell me about your favorite product, right, and why
Yes.
you love that product. And a lot of people love their Nest products. What do you think it was about kind of the timing of Nest? I think about this a lot as a VC. We care about timing a lot. Like I wonder, like what year was it founded? Like 2009 or 11, somewhere in there.
Yeah, you have the right era, yeah.
Somewhere in there. And I often think about this as a VC. Like if the Nest founders, sent me their pitch deck, or they would probably get an intro. Hopefully, get an intro. Would I invest, right?
Hmm.
And what do you think it was like looking back? Because up until that point, we were used to kind of the oddly shaped plastic box thermostat. That was just what it was. Is it the Honeywell or whatever it was? And that's just how
Yep.
they worked. It's like they had 3 ugly gray buttons, and it was like this yellowing box that hadn't changed that much. Oh, we got a little LCD display, whereas before it was like, the stuff that we grew up with in the 80s or whatever. What do you think it was about the timing where
Yeah.
like Nest could succeed when it did, how it did?
I'll give you my perspective. Obviously, there are some that I could really tell you the facts in a way that, they firsthand lived it. I think with something like that, you have this kind of perfect storm of components. I think there was a realization that technology, both hardware technology and software technology, were getting to a point that made some of the technical components possible. What I mean by that is, the guts of the first thermostat, the way that I always thought about it was really a more rudimentary cell phone. And because we had many generations of the iPhone, never mind the fact that the people starting Nest really knew those products intimately, they could carry that over almost seamlessly into a different form factor and different application. But on like the software side, the ability to think about how you might control something remotely through your phone was pretty much, kind of the beginning of that idea, right? Like we're talking about the same era where Uber was just getting started. So this idea that like your phone is now a remote control of sorts was a theme we saw through a lot of things. And so I think when you look at these big phases of technology or themes in the industry, there's this catalyst of like something made it possible. And then you have a team that's interested in a particular problem that's well suited to what the technology is allowing. I think with the early days of Nest, my understanding of it always was that there was such a push on the environmental side, because the thermostat in particular had such a connection to how we use energy and power in our homes. And that, I think, struck a chord with conversations that were going on and what was out in the world that people were starting to be wise to and interested in doing their part. And so that's where, the technology is the enabler, but then you have these other maybe additive pieces that, when all happening at the right time, give that great environment for something to pop up like Nest did.
I guess everybody had that, perfectly crafted iPhone experience around the same time too. And you're just expecting things to, feel great. And the thermostat definitely did not until Nest came along. You published a piece called Design the Product, Not Documentation. Do you recall that paper and like what the core argument was?
Yeah, it was a long time ago and I was very early on. So I think part of my motivation to write was to just organize my own thoughts and learnings and how I was approaching design in the early years of my career. But that was particularly an insight, I think partly driven from hardware development. It might have been written more in the FuelBand era than the Nest era, but same general idea. And what I realized was that a lot of designers would be really proud of the concept that they came up with and the thing that they had shared with their team and a really innovative idea. But the amount of those that make it to what actually ships is far and few between, kind of by nature of what we do. And what I started to realize was that, yes, I needed to make documents and specs, and I needed a way to communicate with engineers and team members to express my ideas, but that it kind of didn't matter what was in that file if it didn't actually make it into people's hands. And what it took to make it into people's hands was explaining myself, 10 times more than I thought was necessary, and double checking my logic 5 times, even though I was pretty convinced it was the right call. There were new pieces of information that kept making me have to rethink a decision that I had made weeks ago, or spending hours just, bug bashing, which of course is such a standard thing we all do today. But we were, learning how to do that on mobile apps and in more interesting platform environments that we hadn't had before. And we were learning how to do that across a hardware device and an app that spoke to each other, which was kind of a harder thing to wrap our heads. Well, how are we going to test this? We had people in the FuelBand days, we had people running up and down the staircase, the emergency staircase in the office building, trying to figure out how to get some points on the band. So when you're making something that doesn't have as much precedent, which that time was just rich with, whether you were in hardware or whether you were in software, didn't matter. You just have to start being creative about how you're going to get the thing to the finish line. And I think the motivation behind that piece was, as a designer, this is my problem too. I can't just sit on my laurels that I made the screens and I made the flows and I gave it, on time so that nobody downstream of me was held up. I have to have ownership in what actually makes it into the customer's hands, because that's the only thing they're ever going to judge the product on.
Speaking of FuelBand, you were at RGA. Do I have to say
yes.
slash?
No. RGA is correct.
There was this moment, you're working on a connected device. Nobody knows. And this is kind of a recurring theme in your career, I guess, which is kind of this hardware software integration. How down into the industrial design are you going versus staying at the kind of the software layer?
I always worked with industrial design teams. I never practiced industrial design professionally, even though that was my kind of degree origins. And so the scenario would be different on different projects. If the device had a lot of buttons and direct interaction on it, there might be more reason to collaborate in those early phases versus a device that maybe was more simplistic and we had to just make sure enough of the pieces of hardware were correct that would give us flexibility down the line of the project lifecycle to determine how the software would use that hardware. So I would say it was pretty sliding scale depending on the type of product and the specifics of what that needed.
What was that like working on the FuelBand? I mean, that was one of the first connected devices, and I'm guessing you had to bring your design the product, not documentation mindset into that.
Yes. Yeah. I came into it, the project was already kicked off and I joined the team midway towards the first launch. So it was totally secret. I was exposed for the first time to a locked down environment.
Where you have to go through multiple layers of security to get to the devices and things like that.
That's right. Exactly. It had so much allure around it that I think I was just, taken by oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm in here and getting to see how this happens. And then, you get into the project, and again, this is pretty early in my career. I might have been designer, senior designer at best at that point. You get into the project and you think, okay, all these super smart people have worked through all of this and they've already been on it for however many weeks, if not months. And I just need to do what I can to help and plug holes. And then you start running into things like any product development, right? Which, I was naive to at the time, where we never talked about how that thing was going to work. It's just kind of either been overlooked or it's just working right now as the assumptions that were made along the way as an output of everything else that was decided. And I started to realize that, I was kind of just assuming somebody knew better. And one of the things I think clicked for me was no, just assume nobody had the time to think about that and that it just went under the radar. And you're better off asking the question and finding out there is an answer than obscuring it or just sitting on it thinking somebody knows this. And so I found one of the things that was really great is that the more that I asked and the more that I poked, the more I realized how new everyone was to it. It didn't matter their years of experience. The problem space was so new, and we didn't have patterns for it. We didn't even have some of the technology setups we needed to really be successful. And so you have to kind of design the tools and the process alongside the product itself.
So you've been a designer, what you might call before Figma and after Figma. How did that change? I remember when that came out, and that I like what a sea change that was for me as a PM.
Yes.
In getting the spec of the design, speaking of design the product, not the documentation, to the the front end devs, right?
Yes.
And now you're basically communicating HTML and CSS, like pretty much like pixel perfect. What was that like? Because I remember back in 2013, we were using like Envision clickable like images, basically images from Adobe.
Yeah, I couldn't even do one better. I think my first design documents were created as if I was making a physical book in InDesign. And then at some point I'd have to print them out, and it would be like a 150-page stack of paper. And what was on which page was kind of a choose your own adventure. Inevitably, an engineer would come and say, "Do you have an answer to this?" I said, "Oh yeah, it's on page 39. Didn't you see it?" Of course they didn't see it.
That's a freaking textbook.
So it was really like a make do with what you have kind of environment. I think when, Figma came around, we were all trying to wrap our head, if I recall correctly, we were all trying to wrap our head around Sketch because that was kind of its predecessor and made this leap to the idea that there could be actually a tool made for this type of design. And we don't have to just repurpose the tools that are out there for other flavors of design and other media in terms of what, like a Photoshop that was optimized more for imagery and print at the time. So it was really interesting, but I think there was this kind of like anything, and quite honestly, with any other software platform that comes around that we use as technical teams, you have this moment of like, is the migration worth it? Is it worth us all stopping and figuring this out? And so I think there was a lot of mixed yes and no's on Sketch and trying to figure out what it would really get us, but a lot of people very excited about the potential. And what I remember is Figma just came in on the heels of that so quickly and just had enough of the pieces that were missing, the cloud hosting, the comments, the ability to really collaborate through the tool and not just be in this endless versioning and, file upload type of situation. And that was just such a game changer. And then I think from there, I think it's allowed the discipline to mature because Figma came along at the time where we started to have some ideas around the best way to handle mobile devices. And we started to have some ideas on the best web practices. And we coalesced on patterns that prior to that, we were all trying all different things in each product. And so Figma being able to be a shortcut to some of those patterns and ability to not have to spend time on what at that point was the easy stuff and get to really just spend time on the core of the product and the functionality unique to that product. I think it was just a huge accelerant. Now, the challenge on my side is by the time Figma came around, I was more and more and more in a management role. And so I'm really good at commenting and I'm really good at breaking some people's files to make a quick edit that I'm trying to communicate. But it is amazing how quickly, you have to really keep up with the tools and learn the tools if you want to stay in it. And something that I'm now looking at, with the new landscape, well, which tools do I want to start learning alongside everybody and not necessarily have a disadvantage there?
Yeah, it's a great segue to the next question, which is sort of, how is the landscape and tools changing with AI? Is there the open Claude or Claude co-work of design out there? Like, how is that changing how you guys do things? Because you can, if you're a PM, you could just go, I don't know, say, make me an interface that does this and that and this other thing. And I've done it, right?
Yes.
Like a lot of people have had that vibe code experience. How's that changing design as a function? And are there like new tools that you guys are evaluating that you're excited about?
Yeah, there's at a minimum, designers are getting the same sort of productivity improvements that everybody's getting, right? Because there's plenty of things that we do that's beyond the pixels or the screen development, right? That these tools are just accelerating. So we're all in it together. But I've been thinking a lot about it lately. I've been trying to use it for my own work, and I've been trying to be more of a, I would say, like an IC mindset in approaching these tools. And one of the things that's become very, very clear to me is that when your work product, hopefully this will make some sense, when your work product was the output of keyboard keys, abstracting that to a different layer of written conversation is a pretty natural progression. It's the type of abstraction we are used to going through as the tech world. When your output is about moving things spatially or adjusting a color or trying to create more breathing room and white space, or thinking about a sequence of things in more of a flow and a logic, or animation for that matter, it doesn't have as much of the natural abstraction to like trying to describe that in words. And so what I've noticed is that the tools are doing a great job of brainstorming. They're doing a great job of getting really high quality concepts and prototypes that would have taken designers a long time to make and maybe wouldn't have explored as wide of a set of options in the past because of the time limitations or expediency. Once you get that first thing back, when you try to start getting it closer to what you might have in mind or where you see optimizations, there's this kind of fatiguing element. The more turns you take and the more specific you're trying to get the AI to change, it almost seems like the harder it is. And so I've been watching, and hopefully I have no preference in this. I have no personal stake in this, but, I've been watching what Claude is doing now with Claude Design, which is in a very, very early state and has some kind of limited access to it right now. And they're starting to use a dual interface where you can manipulate some things in line and then you can chat like we're mostly accustomed to at this point. And I'm really interested in a company called Noon that just came out of stealth mode. It seems like most people are waiting on the wait list. We're not sure if anyone's gotten access just yet, but similar in thinking about how to bridge kind of what a designer needs to where some of the rest of the tools are going. And I'm sure there's more. I think even I haven't gotten a chance to go into depth, but I think even Figma made an announcement in the last 24 hours. So I'm hopeful that this is all just a matter of time and it's just sequencing and what the teams can get to. But it'll be interesting to see how the tools kind of address a more maybe specific and unique type of working style that a designer brings to the table than some of their cross-functional peers.
Yeah, I guess you could say that Figma was kind of the culmination of Web 2.0 tools, right? Interactive, collaborative, user-generated stuff that's in a web interface. And we clearly have not reached the culmination and peak of AI copilot-driven design yet. Maybe it's Claude, maybe it's something else, but something will come along where it's like, okay. And I'm reminded, based on what you said earlier about, a picture is worth 1,000 words, the old cliche, right? And a design is kind of worth, 1,000 words too. And a video walkthrough is probably worth 10,000 words. Let's talk about your SoFi experience. You were there for a long time. Are you still there?
I just stepped away at the end of March.
Wow. Congrats. I mean, you had a very long run. You joined right before COVID, kind of broke everything down. What was that run like? Because SoFi's had a really incredible run and you had your hands probably on everything there.
Yeah, it was a very fast-paced and, rewarding chapter. I had the insight that it was time to leave Google and I wanted to go to a company at a certain size and phase. And SoFi was that in the 2020 time period.
You mean you didn't want to go back to another big political, big tech company? Like,
it's not where I do best. I have a lot of respect for those that do, but
yeah, I'm not a politician. That's my problem.
Yeah.
I say exactly what I mean and I have no filter. And so Microsoft was not a good place for me. People kind of do all the like double speak corporate things. And I'm just like, well, I think you're wrong.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I don't have much of a poker face, I've been told. I always liked the teams that felt a level of urgency to make decisions and ship. And I found that came with like a certain stage in the company's life cycle. Yeah. And yes, you could experience that inside of a big company if that organization is
very much like that. I mean, Amazon felt like a startup, felt like a Series B, C startup, just moving as fast as you can. Everybody's like speaking their mind. There's no like there were politics. This was 10 years ago, but it was completely different from Microsoft.
Yeah. Well, I've never been inside of Amazon, but I could see that based
No.
on the cultural tenets. So if I met a lot of the criteria in terms of like scale and phase, and it was a totally different problem space, which the history you read out maybe explains. I actually like switching after being in a space for a reasonable amount of time and really investing in it. I like switching into a new space because I find it brings a lot of creativity.
Yeah, it's like if you're, like you don't want to sit there and design the next iteration of the thing you've already been working on for multiple generations. I'm guessing as a designer, you're kind of like, all right, it's just another version of Nest, like great. It's a little more spherical now, like,
Yes.
ready to move on,
And the act of learning, I mean, every designer is going to be different, but the act of learning a new space and asking all the questions is just a very creativity kind of inducing mode to be in. So the first couple of years of being in a new space, I always found very exciting.
Yeah. That's why I like being a VC. Like I'm constantly talking to founders and doing new things all the time.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's never a dull moment. It's like, oh, like I didn't know you could do that with like dermatology,
Exactly.
Like nothing I would have ever gone to YouTube and said, show me like what the latest AI is like being used in dermatology. I would never,
That's right. So going to SoFi was, I always had interest in my personal finances. I felt like they were setting themselves up to be in a spot that could really be interesting across what was a very active fintech environment in 2020. Yes, going just 6 weeks before we all ended up at home was a very strange and unpredictable circumstance. I was very fortunate to meet people in the office before that started because I think,
like a month before. Yeah.
yes, just even having one moment of FaceTime was meaningful. But I think what that chapter for me, and I've done a lot of reflection in the last couple of weeks in terms of stepping away, it was really about how do you create a more grown up and mature research and design organization? And I had come from these environments where people were teaching me what that meant. And I was really lucky to work with groups that were coming from environments that had worked with the best and were doing it at such a high level. And then this opportunity was like, okay, what have you learned and how do you put it into practice? And how do you take a company that wants to grow into that and take them through the steps to do it? So a lot of my role was really focused on how to build the discipline and the practice, but of course, how to execute and keep pace with a growing and changing company. And so, yeah, we spanned a lot of different financial segments from banking and investment and more recently re-entering the crypto space. But also the bread and butter of the company historically was loans, and there was a play to move into insurance. So talk about, all different concepts that some of the other fintechs in the space, especially in the earlier years, would have only tackled one of those. And yet we were trying to tackle all of them in parallel. And so a lot to wrap your head around and a lot to kind of figure out as a designer what's shared and what needs to just be the same because you're under one brand and one company and one app, providing one experience to the customer. And then what are all of the variants and specifics that, the products just work different and the verticals just work different and you still have to accommodate all of that in its gory detail. So it was an interesting kind of ecosystem problem to tackle.
Yeah. As an investor, I love teams that have, a builder, like a CTO kind of person. You got the CEO, the salesperson, but I love seeing a designer on the founding team. I think it's a really neat thing when they're, thinking about design right from the beginning, or like it's one of the first hires. What do you think founding teams and founders get wrong about design when they're going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 at their startups?
When you're not a designer, you're coming to it as a founder or a cross-functional peer. It's easy to have a definition of design that is kind of based in whatever you've seen up until that point. And maybe you've seen something really amazing and you're trying to replicate that one-to-one.
You mean every startup has a chat interface now, like right down the center of their screen? Yeah.
Yes, but
it's like
yes.
ChatGPT, but for, for dogs. And it's like this interface. It's right there. Like, see, you just like have the dog look at it and talk to it.
Yes. Well, yeah, there is absolutely an art to knowing when to use the pattern that everybody is using and when to diverge. Absolutely. I also mean it from how does the discipline function inside of the company? What decisions are they making? What do you task the designer with? What permission do you give the designer culturally? How do they sit amongst whoever else is there at that early stage? It's an interesting one. It's like maybe an engineer would say that they've experienced all different interpretations from their cross-functional peers. But from my stance, it seems like the cross-functional definitions of design somehow span a wider breadth. And
There's got to be
so,
like a design meme out there where, like you got the product managers like, but do our customers want it? And then, the engineer is like, but can it scale to 1 million users? And then the designer's like, but is it like easy and fun to use? Right.
yeah.
And it's just like almost like the triangle, cost, scope, and time triangle.
Yes. And I found, like I mentioned before, that Nest was one of the chapters that I often go back to as just amazing learning experience. I found that in that environment, I never had to explain what design did or why I should be in that conversation or what I had to contribute.
That was the differentiator of the company, right? Just better design everyday products,
And the way that was achieved was that every function cared about design. And every function understood that they were making decisions that were contributing to the experience and what other companies might say were contributing to the design. And what best way that I could explain that set of cross-functional partners was that anyone could argue any element of the product development. It didn't have to be in their lane. I had plenty of people tell me what feature they wanted to see next or why the feature should work differently from a design perspective. But once you heard everybody's point of view and you took in all the feedback and contribution, the team really trusted whoever was sitting in that seat to make a final call as a subject matter expert. So you had this constant working in the gray space, everyone working in the gray space, and then this trust that the right person with the decision-making responsibility would ultimately make the right decision. And I think that was like the most maybe inspired and interesting definition of design, where everybody felt responsible for it, but yet allowed the designer to make a call. Whereas, I think where SoFi was in its maturation process, I was coming into a team where we want something different out of the design function, and we want it to be more strategic, and we want the types of results that would come from a strategic minded design team. But we're in a situation where the way information is getting to them and the types of tasks we're tasking them with are far more boxed in and without context and less ownership. And some elements of that is the team at the right seniority? Is the team at the right skill set mix? Do you have the right people doing the right types of things? Like engineering, there's many, many different sets of skills and jobs within a design team. Even if they have a design title, they might not be coming to the table with the same contributions, and a design team knows how to use them. But cross-functionally, do you know if you got the right type of person? So when you're early stage as a founder, I think the question becomes, what are you looking for this to do? How are you thinking about it in the mix of where you're starting? Is this something you want to make as a tenant of your company? And if so, are you appropriately finding someone with seniority and experience the way you would for other disciplines? Is this more of a means to an end to get to an MVP? It doesn't mean that any of those are right or wrong. Does your decision match what you're trying to achieve and what you think is important to that business and that product?
Let's wrap up with some rapid fire wrap-up questions.
Sounds good.
I hesitate to call them rapid fire. They're kind of just loose ends. A loose end section. So you wrote that documentation will never be seen by the user. Only the product matters. Apply that to design leadership. What's the equivalent of over-documenting and how design leaders run their organizations?
I think the equivalent is probably the way the design leaders set up the rituals, right? In the same way, rituals are there to facilitate work, to create some
connection and feedback, and yeah.
Exactly. Make some amount of predictability in what's otherwise a very organic and somewhat chaotic process.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we did a lot with at SoFi, sometimes successfully, sometimes was a learning misstep that we needed to improve, was at each kind of change of scale, we had to look at, are the rituals still working for us, or does it have to adjust? Has the team gotten too big for this format to work? And so being really flexible.
Having like design committee meetings with 30 people in them, you're like, okay.
Oh yeah.
This is probably too many people giving feedback on this experience.
Exactly. There's a tipping point of how many people can be in an effective critique where you're really helping each other as peers. But then there's a purpose to do cross-functional reviews. And do you have the right people in those meetings? And has that changed from when they originally got set up because the dynamics of the company have changed with scale and evolution? And so I think as a leader, you have to be willing to say, this is the process I like to use, and I'm going to bring my expertise to the table, but I also need to be watching what's working for the team. And at some point, the thing I love using may no longer be the right call. And does somebody else have a good idea of what we do next? Or have I thought about it deeply enough that I have an idea of maybe what we'll try in the next phase? But it's that facilitation. It's like the facilitation can't be the thing. The facilitation has to be the means to the outcome that you're really trying to focus everyone on.
So you worked on Matter. Maybe you could explain what that is. And it's a rare thing because it kind of outlived your tenure at those companies and now it kind of lives on in multiple companies.
The thing I worked on at the time was called Thread and Weave, and it was a protocol, networking protocol that Nest created as kind of a necessary component to how the devices were meant to work with each other. And it created a bit of a closed loop system where anything in the house could communicate over a different type of network, what we would have called the mesh network. And it was neither Wi-Fi nor Bluetooth, which like blew my mind when I got there. Somebody tried to explain that to me and I said, what do you mean there's a third thing?
It's like a whole nother radio frequency. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. And I really thought the person didn't know what they were talking about for the first 20 minutes of the conversation. Yeah. And I go, wait, I don't know what I'm talking about. So it was really a fascinating project to work on. And what eventually happened is we all knew that with these home devices, locking somebody into one environment just didn't seem like it was going to be practical over a long period of time. But when I was working on it, we didn't know how we were going to get there. And the team that lived on with it eventually turned it into what we now call Matter, and I'm sure it's evolved quite a bit. But it was fascinating because it was true technology innovation. And when you're thinking about radio frequencies and mesh networks, and yet part of the reason I was hired was because I had worked on the onboarding and pairing elements of the FuelBand. And so I knew that it was a totally different problem when I got in, but from the outside, it looked like kind of the same design problem. And that was how my involvement started there.
So you've been around a lot of different teams, and we talked a little bit about founders and setting up kind of design cultures, but what is a single most common design mistake early stage companies are making and a thing that you'd fix in the first 30 days if you went into like an early stage startup?
My honest answer is I would assess and I would try to figure out what I thought maybe the bottleneck was. But one of the common things that I would imagine might be worth fixing early on would be, how is the start of a project developing? It's really easy to bring in each function at the point at which it's obvious that function needs to contribute. But I think the best products and the best teams actually think about over communication and inclusion really, really early in a project before it's obvious that all of those people need to be in the meetings and tracking along. And I think as a designer, especially if you have a really talented design team and really capable individuals on the team, the more context you can get them in the beginning of a project, the more that they can really be utilized in the fullest sense. And so that's something that I tend to look for.
Design communities tend to celebrate process sprints, design thinking, double diamonds, qualitative panels. So you published a piece that says process is a trap and the product is the only thing that matters. That was a long time ago. Has your view evolved, or do you kind of stick to that point?
I think it depends. I still think some of the language we use to talk to ourselves falls flat with our partners. I think we can be at times, and I apologize to the design community, but we can be like a little bit too esoteric about things and think that that's going to be what makes it through, when really our partners just want to know when we're going to have the answer and if it's going to be by the deadline they're expecting.
Yeah. When will you have the design?
That's right.
Yeah, we need it. We start our sprint Monday and it is Friday afternoon.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And so those
Can you have it done by Monday morning? You know, like I remember all these conversations.
Yes. And there's a whole other piece, right, where you have to set realistic expectations and negotiate about those types of things. But, you know, I think those tools serve a purpose when it's the ritual or the approach that gets to the conclusion or the next step that the team is trying to unlock. But it's not because they have a fancy name and a fancy concept behind it and that everybody participating in that ritual needs to fully understand it. It's because it might be the right tool for the job. And so, you know, we, in more recent years, we pushed really hard on design sprints. And one of the conversations that would happen internally in the design leadership team would be like, some of these things we're calling a sprint isn't really a sprint, or it's some other form of a sprint that we would call something totally different.
It could just be a
And
block of work, you know?
right.
Yeah. It's
And
a chunk of
so,
work.
I mean, they're probably sick of me saying this, but I said, look, right now, all of our partners understand what a sprint is, and they are bought into it, and they're seeing the results of it. And we want to keep doing these. Now is not the time to get technical about the name and which variant we're doing when
Does
and
that
why
mean I have
this
to
is fit.
do I have to work faster and sacrifice quality in a sprint? Designers are like really thinking it through, right?
Yes.
What is the essence of a sprint? Let's like talk about it.
Yes, we like to noodle on those details,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
part of what we do, but when misplaced it can be counterproductive. And so
Yeah.
I've just never subscribed so much to the precision of the names and the kind of on paper process. And it's more about which thing is going to facilitate what we need in the moment, and try to be a little bit more organic and flexible with the process.
What's something you've changed your mind on that you like used to believe that you no longer believe, or vice versa?
That's a good one. I think, I think when it comes to design, I think that I'm a little bit more understanding and flexible to meet the business where the business is. I think when you start out in design, you want everything to be at the most resolved, beautiful, elegant,
Yeah.
thought
It's
out.
like when the further you go from the code through design, through product, through the rest of the organization, the messier things get.
Yes.
You know, like up here in the business world, it's messy. You know, lots of
Yes.
politics and different product lines and different, just all kinds of different constituents and different needs and functions. And then you get like
Absolutely.
a little bit more pure design is like, the physics of products, right? What I mean by that is like mathematicians kind of shit on physics people and vice versa. But like you guys are like, this is how things work, and this is like, and then along come the coders and I'm like, no, this is like math. It's pure, it's code, right? And it's
I've never
elegant.
heard it put that way, but I follow
I
you.
just
I
came
follow
up with
you.
that. This is what I do. I just come up with stuff on podcasts and I get paid for it, I guess now.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, you start out in design wanting to make the world beautiful, right? And do the
Yeah.
best you possibly can. And it's not to say that that part of my opinions changed, but what's appropriate for the problem being solved, and where is the perfection maybe a necessary trade-off to efficiency or speed to market or some other thing that's going to be highly critical and important to the product and the business success. And I think I had a really early awakening to that kind of started the path of changing my mind when I started managing, where there were times I had to make a call against my team's recommendation. And it wasn't because I didn't understand the team's recommendation or they weren't well reasoned in the recommendation, but I was responsible for working cross-functionally to understand how that stacked up against other constraints and requirements. And sometimes a different requirement had to win out. And so it is interesting to have to kind of learn that lesson. And then once you do, find a way to apply it where you're not losing your standards or expectations, but applying it at the right times.
Yeah. Well, that was a really fun conversation. I learned a lot and really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.